Welcome to Autism Tips and Tools, where we highlight the best practical guidance from previous episodes of Autism Knows No Borders. Whether you're a self-advocate, a family member, or a service provider, there's something here for you. I'm Rachel Harmon, a professional in the field of autism services, outreach, and advocacy. And the following clip is from my conversation with Tom Oliver, an autism self-advocate, TEDx speaker, and aspiring lawyer from Australia. Tom has dedicated his career to helping autistic individuals who got caught up in the justice system. Listen to him discuss some autistic traits that can be underlying causes of crime among people on the spectrum, and when the courts should recommend therapy instead of incarceration. Okay, so back to the characteristics that you were describing. So one is the misreading of social cues. What are the other two?
Yeah, so misreading and also an inability to respond to the social cues as well. So essentially what I've done is I've looked at an array of case law and found three categories which were really quite discrete. And the second one was hypersensitivities. So this often entails losing control after experiencing a sensory overload, which wouldn't typically affect a person without autism. Found that autistic people may have too high or too low a pain threshold, be hypersensitive or hyposensitive to touch, sound, smells, or the like. And they also have a very strong craving and propensity for consistency, predictability, as well as structure and routine in their environment. And what was an overwhelming pattern was that when an autistic person had a disruption or unpredictability in this regard into their structure and routine, it can be very distressing for them, an autistic person. It can lead to frustration and rage. And in turn, it can render them very susceptible indeed to committing crimes such as trespass to person and trespass to property. And for example, there was a case here in Australia wherein an autistic man, let's call him Tim, he went to catch a bus, but Tim forgot his concession card. And when the bus inspector was questioning Tim as to why he'd forgotten his concession card, all of a sudden Tim actually assaulted the bus inspector because the bus inspector just brushed past Tim's arm, and Tim was also imprisoned. So really, really unfortunate case there.
Mm-hmm. So in that case, how would you try and argue for a just consequence?
Yeah, so in that case, to distill it down, is essentially if Tim were to go to prison because he has autism, and we'd obviously bring in expert witnesses to the courtroom, we'd essentially argue that imprisonment isn't going to change the fact of Tim's hypersensitivity to touch. Obviously, when the bus inspector brushed past Tim's arm, Tim was unable to cope. And so we'd also potentially argue for self-defense, because if Tim's more hypersensitive than the average person, there could be a greater argument for self-defense as opposed to if he didn't have that hypersensitivity to touch. And we'd argue for various therapy over imprisonment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So you're not necessarily just letting him off the hook for what happened. Like there still needs to be a consequence, and maybe the bus driver also needs to know and understand that something is being done about the offense towards him.
Yes, and I'll also elaborate by saying in the legal system, or at least here in Australia, we have what we call general deterrence and we have specific deterrence. So general deterrence is whereby you are punishing a person and in doing so deterring the general public from committing a like offence. Whereas specific deterrence is where you, by punishing a person, deterring that specific person from committing that offence. And essentially what we argue, and what we have argued in the past, is that general deterrence ought not to apply when punishing an autistic person, because obviously the general public doesn't necessarily have autism. And so that's one of the ways in which we argue in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so staying with this example, what kind of therapy would you suggest?
That's a great question. And this is another area that is lacking severely. And obviously I'm not an OT or a therapist. I'm a lawyer, so I can't speak with qualification. But essentially there are some programs that I think I've heard of some professionals who use exposure therapy. There are other therapies of which I can't recall the name of, and that's not what I specialize in ultimately, but yeah, that's where research is needed as well.
I see.
I'll also add there that a lot of the therapy, by having established programs, that's all well and good, but especially with autistic people, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And so what is often the case is that you need personalised therapy that might not be pervasively implementable, in the sense that what might work for one person might not necessarily work for another person on the autism spectrum, because it is indeed quite a broad, pervasive spectrum.
Thanks for tuning in to Autism Knows No Borders. Would you like to hear Tom's ideas on how to reduce injustice towards autistic people? Follow the link in the show notes for the full conversation. And be sure to subscribe for more stories from people connected to autism, inspiring change and building community. Let's work together to transform how the world relates to autism. Thanks for listening. Take care.